if we recall the last few weeks, the first week we talked about the call. Last week we talked about the cost of that call, which was very sobering. I think it was enough to make me kind of second guess my yes. But this week and next week makes it all better, brings us back around, because we're going to focus on the perks of discipleship. The main one being the biggest blessing from discipleship is intimacy with God. You know, in Exodus chapter 6, verse 7, it's one of my favorite verses from the Old Testament. It's God is talking to Moses and telling him to go tell the Israelites about this covenant love relationship he wants to have with them, that he will take care of them. He will bring them out of slavery, bring them into the promised land. And he says, you will be my people and I will be your God. And if you really dwell on that, it's just beautiful. It's that covenant love, intimate relationship that God wants to have with each one of us, not just Israelites thousands of years ago, but with you and with me. He says, I will be your God and you will be my Susie, my Chelsea, my Mary Jo, my Stephanie. You know, it's this personal relationship. And when we talk about intimacy with God, you know, that word intimacy kind of makes you bristle a little bit, because you think of it in sensual terms or worldly terms. And so to say intimacy with God right away, it sets you kind of in a weird place. But we got to get over that. And when I think of intimacy with God, yesterday was All Saints Day. I think of the saints and how they would talk about this incredible closeness and connection with God. That's the definition of intimacy, is a sense of closeness, mutual trust, caring and acceptance, a sense of connection. And I think that's the heart of this trust that's so elusive that we talk about all the time. We've got to find a way to get that connection. And obviously prayer is how we connect with God. But don't you sometimes I feel like, you know, like he doesn't show up, or I would love to just feel that connection, but I feel like he just doesn't show up. And then I realized as I was going through the lesson this week, is it really him that doesn't show up, or is it me that's not showing up? Because this intimate connection that we really desire and is being offered to us requires something that we're not really comfortable with at all, and that's vulnerability, the dreaded V. I know a lot of you have heard of Brene Brown, the researcher, speaker, author. She has an awesome TED Talk on vulnerability, and in it she says that we are neurobiologically hardwired for connection. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. Our well-being rests on feeling connected and a sense of belonging. And as Christians, we take it kind of a step further and say that we're hardwired spiritually for connection with God and to belong to God. And like as St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless till they rest in him. That void is hardwired in us. And just like Brene says, you know, we sabotage these connections by shame. You know, we say, well, I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not, skinny enough. I'm not this enough, whatever. Or if they really knew me, ... We sabotage that connection by feeling, that we're not worthy of love and belonging. And we can do the same thing in our relationship with God. We do the same thing out of shame or feelings of unworthiness. We live with this inability to really believe that we are worthy of this covenant love, unconditional love relationship that's being offered to us. And Brene Brown interviewed people who seemed to have a real strong sense of that love and belonging, and believed very deeply that they were worthy of love and belonging. And she labeled a file, these people's names she kept in, and it was called Wholehearted. And they had three things in common, these wholehearted people. They had, number one, courage, but it was courage to be imperfect. How many of us have the courage to be imperfect? And they had compassion, primarily to themselves first. They were kind and gentle to themselves, because unless we can have compassion on ourselves, we can't hope to have compassion for anybody else, because we're going to feel resentful. We're going to overdo. We're going to be like Martha. We're going to be, have the martyr complex. We're going to, until we can have compassion for ourselves. And that's what I saw in Mary, the story of Martha and Mary. We'll get into that in a minute. We can't have compassion for others. So these wholehearted people, they have the courage to be imperfect. They have compassion for themselves, and they're gentle with themselves. And as a result, they experience connection. It makes them authentic. That they let go of who they think they should be, and they are who they are. And don't you know people like that? And it feels so good to be around them. They fully embrace vulnerability. This vulnerability, by definition, is a quality of being that exposes us to the possibility of emotional or physical harm. So it's a scary place to be, but it's a place we have to become comfortable with. To be vulnerable, we need to be able to allow ourselves to be seen. Don't try to be perfect. Be kinder and gentler with ourselves, and love with our whole hearts as a result. And that's how we need to show up in prayer with God. And if we find it hard to do that in our lives, to be vulnerable like that, we for sure are going to have that same problem with vulnerability in our relationship with God. But to be vulnerable is what fosters the intimacy and the connection, which then produces the trust that we want so badly, that we've been looking for so badly. But it starts with this vulnerability. So how do we do that? How can we come to this relationship with that vulnerability? We see in the readings today perfect examples of it. In Luke 7:1-10, the healing of the centurion's slave, that centurion was vulnerable by declaring his unworthiness and his faith in Jesus. He was a Gentile, but he intuitively understood that although he had no right to ask this of Jesus, he knew that Jesus would be willing to give him everything. Somehow he knew that about Jesus. But he says, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I'm not worthy to have you enter under my roof. Therefore, I do not consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word and let my servant be healed. We hear this at Mass over and over again. He very authentically and honestly admitted he is not perfect. And this ability to admit that, this courage not to have to be perfect and admit that he's not perfect, is what fostered this intimacy with Jesus. It amazed Jesus. It said, when Jesus heard this, he was amazed, and turning, he said to the crowd, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. Imagine to be able to amaze Jesus that by this just honest, vulnerable declaration of unworthiness, but faith at the same time. The second example we have of this vulnerability is the Martha and Mary story. I loved your conversations about it. It's one that elicits a lot of conversation in many circles. And some of us get a little defensive about it, the Marthas in us. I like the comment about, well, they wouldn't have eaten if Martha wasn't Martha. And I think it was Kate that said, yeah, but Jesus fed, the 5,000 with a fish and a loaf of bread. So it might not have been a fancy meal, but it would have been a meal. But I think Mary for sure would have gone in Brene Brown's wholehearted file. She risked a lot out of her love for Jesus. Just the fact in first century Palestinian Judaism, for a woman to take that posture of sitting at the feet of a master was unheard of. She risked a lot. That was a huge thing. but she didn't care. And that's part of vulnerability, is being bold, making the first move, knowing that maybe you still will be rejected. It's saying, I love you first, forgiving first. But Mary, she allowed herself to be seen as who she really was. She didn't try to be perfect. She made this bold move of vulnerability and exhibited this wholehearted love for Jesus. And because of it, she experienced this intimacy and this connection with Jesus. He told her that she had the best part. If vulnerability is hard for you, the Mary and Martha story is going to not sit well. Some of you called it disturbing, and it truly is, because it's a in-your-face example of this vulnerability, this ability to just be who you are, to not be perfect all the time, to let this this risk taking out of wholehearted love take over. And lastly, this in Luke 12:22-34, this dependence on God is an excruciatingly vulnerable example of how we are, or an example of how we are to be vulnerable. You touched on this too in your small groups, that since we're little, the world teaches us to be self-reliant. Dependence is almost a dirty word. It's almost, it connotes weakness, to have to be dependent on something, that, you should always stand on your own 2 feet. But in the spiritual world, it's completely different. The hallmark of the strength and courage it takes to be a true disciple is our dependence, but it's our dependence on God. It's what we probably spend our whole lives trying to accomplish, and it's something admirable. And I love these verses 22-28, especially, I don't know, I've been watching the birds a lot because I have nothing else to do, and they tend to be around a lot. And it really struck me how totally clueless they are, that they just show up and there's food, and it just watch them sometimes and think about how they had no idea that I was going to go put the bird seed in those things today, and then they're off to the next one. And it's awesome. But in these verses, it says, therefore, do not worry about your life and what you will eat, or about your body and what you will wear, for life is more than food, and body more than clothing. Notice the ravens, they do not sow or reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, yet God feeds them. How much more important are you than birds? Can any of you, by worrying, add a moment to your lifespan? If even the smallest things are beyond your control, why are you anxious about the rest? I mean, that's like it in a nutshell. Here is the God of the creator of all, this unbelievably powerful, huge God, who promises that he will take care of us. Why is it so hard? And all we have to do is trust. But the catch is, we have to trust like a child. And I learned this very powerfully by a little giraffe. I'm going to show you his picture. By a little giraffe on Saturday, trick-or-treating. Can you see this? This little giraffe is Drew, our youngest grandson. Now I want you to, I'm going to show you this again, because I want you to put yourself in that suit. All right. And you're about, I don't know how tall he is, but in just short inches off the ground. Okay. And that's you in that suit. He went trick-or-treating for the first time in his 16-month life. And okay, so he's doing this thing that he had never done before. It was dark. It was strange. He was experiencing the world in a completely different way than he ever knew before. All right, so picture yourself in his little suit at that level on trick or treat night in the dark. And so he'd be walking and he'd fall. Okay, so you fall, and all of a sudden you feel these arms underneath you lifting you up and putting you back up again, and you start walking again. And then he'd walk off kind of, like up a lawn or something, and all of a sudden he'd feel this arm turn him so that he got back on path. And then he it was like someone's eyes were on him constantly, but he had no idea. He's just moving along. And when he was tired, this little red wagon showed up next to him, and there were those arms again. They picked him up, set him in the wagon, and he was off. And then to top it all off, when he was all done and he comes back home and he's sitting down, all of a sudden he's looking around, and this hand, that hand puts a little piece of a Reese's peanut butter cup in his mouth. For the first time he tasted chocolate and peanut butter, and it came out of nowhere. It's because of his total dependence that he had the most fun of anybody that night. The smile on his face and the joy on his face, people were commenting on it. He would squeal. He would walk up to the table of candy and just squeal and smile. He was pure joy. And he had no idea anything but joy, because every time he fell, he went off path, he was tired, those arms were there, and he didn't know where they were coming from. He had this little, he taught me in that moment, he modeled for me the deepest blessing of a life of discipleship. It's that pure joy that can only come from childlike trust. The trust that's the basis for this intimate relationship with God. And as disciples, God's promising us that same comfort and guidance and pick me up and care and eyes on us. And he promises to take care of us. We just have to seek first the kingdom, and all the rest will be added, including maybe a Reese's peanut butter cup. And he's pleased to do it. That's what I loved in chapter 12, verse 32. It says, "Don't be afraid, my little flock of giraffes, for your Father is pleased to give you the kingdom." So do I have the courage to be vulnerable in our relationship with God, in our discipleship, in order to know intimacy, which then leads us to that ever elusive trust we've been looking for? Are we willing to be seen as we really are? Admittedly, the imperfect yet faithful centurion, the risk-taking, wholehearted lover that was Mary, or that crazy, totally dependent, crazy with joy little giraffe? Will you pray with me? The Lord said to her in reply, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and worried about many things. There is need of only one thing. Lord, this day, let us find that one thing." Amen.